Welcome, everyone. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Public Programs Director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. Welcome to the latest in our Yiddish Civilization lecture series. This lecture series is a part of YIVO's intensive Yiddish summer program, where students from all around the world come to YIVO to learn the Yiddish language and its literature and its culture for 6 weeks. And so these lectures are both a part of their curriculum for the summer and also open to the broad public, which dovetails nicely in with YIVO's mission of making its archival collection and its library and all of the history and the culture that it represents available to the public in a variety of ways, through classes, through public programs, exhibitions, and of course through the material being available to researchers who are using it every day. So today, we're really thrilled to have with us Steve Zipperstein, who himself is an alum of the YIVO summer program. Steve Zipperstein is one of the true elder statesmen of the Jewish studies world, and I think needs one of the true statesmen of the Jewish studies world, and really needs no introduction. But I'll just say that Steve has written and edited 9 books, which include most recently Pogrom, Kishna, and The Tilt of History. And he's right now working on a biographical study of Philip Roth. So we're really thrilled to have Steve Zipperstein with us today. Please join me in welcoming.
I thank my young friend Alex. I actually just as I was thinking how to open this talk, I started doing the math and calculating how many years ago I was in the Yiddish program. It was just about 4 decades ago, and I did start feeling as old as Alex actually assumes me to be. You'll hear me. And the last time this is the only place I've ever spoken, and I've spoken often at YIVO. I know. Oh, you're taping. Okay, so I'll cooperate. I remember coming to YIVO in my 20s and beginning to do research here on my dissertation, which ended up being my first book, History of the Jews of Odessa. And it was the only place I'd ever been in, and I grew up in a rather rambunctious Orthodox community in Los Angeles, but it was the only place I'd ever been in where I witnessed out-and-out arguments at funerals, and over Polish Yiddish, Litvish Yiddish. I can't remember quite what they were, but the arguments were rife in what was the YIVO building at 86th and 5th, one of the most precious study halls, a kind of marvelous secular base medrash, but filled with some of the most unlikely figures. The person who actually brought the books to us, Mr. Romanovich, I won't insult him because this was many years ago, and he was then much older than I am, and had been a Bundes heavy, and he would argue with you if you ordered the same title of different editions, and he looked something like one of the evil protagonists in Fargo. I forget which one. I remember that the YIVO building had the slowest elevator in existence, going up from the 1st floor to the 5th floor, and there was then an expert, hopefully he's not sitting in this room, on Alsatian Yiddish, who looked exactly like the Son of Sam. And this was the summer of the Son of Sam, and I remember going up the elevator with him and thinking that I was risking my life to write my dissertation. And the head of the janitorial staff was one of the leaders of the Young Bund in Vilna. The bookkeeper was a ghetto hero. It was the most extraordinary place and one of the most contentious of places for all kinds of reasons. And what it brought home to me, if the material that I was studying didn't bring this home to me adequately, was the ideological fervor that informed our knowledge about the East European Russian Jewish past, the contested nature of it. And while we, as young historians, American-born, seen as having been born with silver spoons in our mouths, patronized by so many of the East European Jewish historians who in one way or another had brushed up against hell, saw us as unlikely to do anything useful, which made us work harder, perhaps crush the souls of a few. I won't name names. I had a wonderful youth. Anyway, I mention all this now because what you want to appreciate that as one writes history, what one is trying to do is to enter into rooms, in effect, that you've never been in, and to recreate what went on in those spaces with the use of those papers that happened to fall from a desk and were put in a file for all sorts of reasons, often in the context of this world, ideological reasons, placed in a file, and that are called archives, are called primary sources. All of you have experienced, no doubt, because all of you presumably have families, how often you've experienced being in a room and leaving the room, and 5-10 minutes later on, the people who were in that room remember what transpired differently from you. And we're never in those rooms. And so our job is to try as best as possible, as laboriously as possible, as accurately as possible, to recreate what went on in those rooms. And thank God for tenure. And because this often takes a long time, and in the context of the fields that so many of us work in, we work in multiple languages, on material sequestered away in uncomfortable places. As often as not, my wife has asked me why I didn't go into Italian Jewish history, and try to do what we're doing as effectively as we can. From the moment that I started, and in deciding on writing on Jewish Odessa, in some ways, objectively, it made no sense. This was during the Soviet period. I was not permitted to actually enter the Soviet Union, even on a tourist visa. There was another Zipperstein, a psychiatrist from Los Angeles who had been a member of the Communist Party and then had become a Schachmanite or one of those. He'd fallen into one of those ideological holes which made him unacceptable. Zipperstein was on a list, and I couldn't even get a tourist visa. I remember going to Bucharest, hoping to go to Odessa, was not permitted to actually cross from one city to the other. Material about Vilna was all over. YIVO material about Odessa, very difficult to find, and one had to sequester it mostly from the press, and the Russian language, Yiddish, Hebrew press, and other bits and pieces here and elsewhere. But I was intent on doing this, and I offer this to those of you who are starting out as a lesson, because topics can't be assigned to you. First of all, you live with them. If what you do is in any way effective, believe me, you live with them for decades. Also, there's something very deeply personal about what it is you write, and it has to be deeply personal because you're living with this day in and day out, and if you're truly living with it, You're living with the sentences. You're turning around the sentences at night. You're turning around the sentences as your partner turns to you and says, please stop turning around those sentences. You live with your topic for a long time, and your topic has to fit you, and Odessa fit me as I vaguely understood, albeit in rather inchoate way, in my mid-20s, having grown up Orthodox, having left Orthodoxy, having learned something about Odessa. I wanted to write about a place in the Russian Empire where Jews acted differently than what tended to be remembered about the sanctified, holy, traditional Jews of Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire. The impulse really started there. The impulse, frankly, started in reading Isaac Babel. And that impulse was sufficiently strong to dissuade me from doing something that would have been perfectly reasonable and logical and intellectually enriching, but just not something that, frankly, spoke to my soul. There's scholarship, as I've come to see it, has to connect both heart and mind. And if it doesn't, you feel there's something lacking, at least from my experience, the experience I've had with training a good many graduate students. From the outset, I was aware that the world that we're trying to study, the East European, Russian, Jewish world, was all the more difficult to study because so much of it ended up being seen through the prism of contending ideologies. So much of the knowledge ended up being shaped by ideologies, even by ideologies that have passed from the scene, ideologies that weren't expressly Jewish, but that drew in Jews because of the universalistic hunger that Jews felt, understandably, in this region, because these ideologies often the prospect of fraternity beyond the Jewish world. One of my favorite jokes from the turn of the century Eastern Europe, and this is what happens after living with this material for years, you actually have a favorite joke from the turn of the century 20, is what language do you speak at an Esperanto conference? Yiddish. The founder, of course, is the Warsaw Jew. Almost all of the followers are Jews hungry to forge this universal language with the assumption that if one speaks the same language, there will be peace and understanding throughout the world. Just look at our political culture today. And in any event, so much of what we ostensibly knew about this world and was ideologically inflected, so much of what YIVO itself was about was infused by a kind of moderate Jewish socialism inflected by the Buddhism in one sort or another, certainly anti-communist. And I worked for a year as the assistant archivist at the Bund Archives, and the only two questions I was asked were questions about my language skills and whether any of my close relatives were communists. It was assumed that a second cousin was okay, but a first cousin, certainly anyone closer, would be dangerous. And it's understandable in many ways that this is such an ideologically inflected material. In many ways, the stories that we tell about East European Russian Jewry are both the Genesis and Exodus stories of so much of Ashkenazic Jewry. The Exodus story of so much of East European Jewry who leave in such large numbers from that region to the United States, the catastrophe that engulfs so many of those who remain. These stories end up being much like biblical stories, much like origin stories, inflected immeasurably more by myth than by history. And I searched intermittently over the years about some effective way of talking about this while writing about other themes as well, and then frankly stumbled on the book that I published just last year that speaks directly to the interplay between history and mythology in the immediate Russian Jewish past. My book, published by Norton in 2018 on the Kishna Pogrom. And I want to just turn to how it actually helped me understand this interplay with greater clarity than I ever had before. I'll talk for another half hour or so and then open up for discussion. And if there's not sufficient discussion, I'll have failed. I didn't start out writing this book. I signed a contract with the trade publisher to write a cultural history of all of East European jewelry from the late 18th century to present. And just in order not to suffer from insomnia for the next several years, I subdivided the book into various sections and decided to spend 3, 4, 5 weeks on each, and one of those sections was the Kishna Pogrom. And what persuaded me that there was a book here was the following. I knew of something about the backdrop of the Kishna Pogrom to the writing of Chaim Nachman Bialik's famous poem, Bir HaRiga, translated by Vladimir Jabotinsky into Russian. In many ways, the Russian version was one of the clarion calls for Jews during the revolution of 1905. I knew something about the impact of this poem on the creation of the precursor to the Haganah, the Israeli army, but not much more. What I learned fairly early on was the following, and which actually just took up a paragraph of the book because I couldn't say much more, and I'll explain why briefly a little bit later. But what I learned was the following. What I learned was that in what was, by general consensus, the most momentous of all meetings of Russian Marxism, the Second Party Congress in 1902, a Congress that begins in Brussels, ends up in London, massively long speeches that could, compete with any deadly Yom Kippur sermon. At this meeting, and it's the meeting where actually Lenin wins a really crucial vote over the organization of the party. It's as a result of winning this vote that his part of Marxism becomes known as those of the majority, consequently known as the Bolsheviks. The ones who lose the vote are called the Mensheviks. Mensch is less. And we've come to learn over the years that in politics, whoever controls language controls so much. Think of the fate of the word liberal over the last several decades and what actually has been done to it. Lenin loses almost every other subsequent vote, but he wins this vote and he captures the word Bolshevik, and he's able to win this vote because he manages to maneuver the representatives of the Jewish Socialist Labor Bund out of the meeting. They walk out of the meeting and he's able to capture the majority. Why is it that they walk out of the meeting? Because what Lenin is focusing on is the capacity of the party itself to make decisions independent of its various units. And by far the most numerical unit, most numerous unit at the time is the Jewish Socialist Labor Bund, who are insisting on relative autonomy, the capacity to make decisions for themselves. Why are they emphasizing the need to make decisions on their own for Jewish needs? Precisely because this meeting is in August 1903 and the Kishna Pogrom was in April 1903. And they're all the more preoccupied with defending the lives of Jews. But in a universalistic setting, then, and to some extent still now, you can't actually argue for expressly Jewish needs. So Kishinev is only mentioned once in passing. The Kishinev is the ether of this meeting, the most formative meeting in the history of Russian Marxism before 1917. What I came to realize was the ubiquitous impact of the Kishna Pogrom, that even when not mentioned, even when not cited, nonetheless exerted an influence, and that made me start looking at what I found surprised me a great deal. I was aware that this was one of the smaller of pogroms. There were 47 Jews killed, 2 others who died of wounds incurred during the pogrom a little bit later. And in contrast, some 600 Jews were slaughtered on the streets of Odessa 2 years later in 1905. Odessa came to be known for many things, but not for pogroms. Why Kishinev? The very word pogrom, I came to realize by tracing its usage in the German, French, and English press, was just one of a medley of terms, and not the most widely used term, used to describe anti-Jewish riots before 1903. By 1904, it was as well known a Russian word as vodka and Tsar. And yet through 1903, when used, it either was defined in the press or it was put in italics with the assumption that it was not well known. What I came to realize was that this catastrophe, which lasted no more than a day and a half, and really the most intense aspect of the catastrophe occurred on 6 intersecting alleyways, tiny alleyways that I've subsequently visited over the course of 4 hours, with those 4 hours being the best documented and best known moments of the Russian Jewish past. Why this and why not other events? Why did this pogrom end up leaving a far greater and more resonant impact than the massive pogroms that convulsed this region after the fall of the Romanovs and with the onset of the Bolshevik Revolution, when as many as 200,000 Jews were murdered and probably as many women raped. And with those catastrophes at best being local, marked by local memorials, as opposed to Kishna Pogrom himself, as I came to learn so much. Part of it, and this will be only part of the story, had to do with chronology. It was the first major anti-Jewish event of its kind at the beginning of a century, the 20th century, that was ushered in as seen as a century of peace and harmony and world harmony. And so it produced that notion. So first chronology, then ideology. It happened at a moment of unusual influence on the part of Jewish socialism, Zionism. A year before Peter Herzl died in 1904, the Jewish Socialist Labor Bund is at its height. It's going to decline numerically and otherwise after the revolution of 1905, and a host of other ideologies that are shaping the Jewish street. So chronology, ideology, but also technology. Its impact had a great deal to do with the influence of newspapers, and especially photography. Photography invented long before, but photography used by newspapers is enormously expensive. This is the first Jewish catastrophe about news of which is disseminated via photography. And news about it can be disseminated all the more effectively via photography, ironically enough, because of relatively small numbers of newspapers. You can actually picture, and the picture was the map of the world, 47 shrouded Jews. And such a photograph of ends up being focused on these 47 shrouded Jews who are stretched out for a day or so with their photographs circulated throughout the world. So part of the answer is seems to have to do with chronology, ideology, and technology. But then the story has to be a picture. What I came to learn is that almost everything ends up being remembered about arsenal of non-Jews, friendly to Jews, unfriendly to Jews. The most potent example of a text that has an impact in many ways, as Jews would see it, no doubt, a beneficial impact on Jewish history is the so-called Plebe letter. Plebe is familiar. Here we go. I've been wandering. Hello? Oh, I hate the echo.
I'll fix it.
What if I promise to stay close to this? No, what? Oh, I'll stay close. I won't move.
All right. Now this is going.
When the two mics are off, that's why. When the two mics are on, that's why the problem.
Okay, I can talk about technology, but I know nothing about technology. Okay. Okay. The first artifact is the Pleva letter. It surfaces in the Times of London about 3 weeks after the end of the pogrom, sometime in the second week of May. And the letter, signed by the Minister of the Interior, basically offers a green light to marauders. And it's a letter addressed to the Governor General of the region, indicating that he shouldn't do anything to put down the riot. It's widely believed throughout the world that Pleva wrote it. Even Pleva's staff is momentarily convinced that he wrote it. By and large, it's because of the Pleva letter, and it's proof that the Russian government is actually wreaking havoc on its own streets, murdering its own subjects, raping its own subjects, that there is relatively unrestricted immigration, Jewish immigration to the United States until the 1920s. This happens in 1903, 1 year after the restriction against Chinese in 1902 is reaffirmed, and the Pleva letter is a forgery. The Pleva letter, in many ways, not only consolidates, provides the primary ammunition for the argument that there should be relatively unrestricted Jewish immigration to the United States, but also demonstrates to Jews the inevitable wedding between the political conservatism of the most quintessentially conservative state in Europe, Russia. Romania is pretty awful too, but the most conservative state, and anti-Semitism. And in many ways, the Pleva letter is one of the crucial ingredients in creating that wedding between Jews and the left, eventually between Jews and liberalism. The notion that that conservatism is fundamentally inimical to Jews. And I say this as someone who is wedded. I come to you from Berkeley, but it's chastening to recognize that one's own most resolute beliefs in many instances are themselves the products of myth, are the products of ahistory, are the products of things that actually didn't happen. And the Pleva letter has an enormous impact on the fate of Jews being able to come to this country, and the genesis of that wedding, that curious wedding, that as Himmelfarb once put it, whereby Jews live like Episcopalians, tend to live like Episcopalians, but in America vote like African Americans. And then another forgery. We don't know who wrote the Pleva letter. It was either Jewish radicals, friendly non-Jewish radicals. We don't know. And the Pleva letter, no doubt, was written with sincerity. It was written with the belief that if Pleva could be tied down in the way that someone is tied down in Homeland and interrogated, this is what he would admit to. And so, inasmuch as such proof was inaccessible, you were, to be sure, putting words into Pleva's mouth, but words that were without doubt sincere and authentic and true, and much the same is true for the other document that I'm going to describe, vastly different from the Pleva letter, that has had no less of an impact, perhaps more of an impact, than the Pleva letter on Jewish fate, and was produced also in the immediate wake of the Kishna Pogrom, and as a result of the worldwide hubbub that the Kishna Pogrom generated. Then President Roosevelt condemns Russia. There's Hearst, the newspaper tycoon, insists, he's then in Congress, that America declare war on Russia because of the Kishna Pogrom. In the wake of this hubbub, the first version of the document that we know today as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is written. And written by We know this, we know it was written by figures in and around Kishinev because of its linguistic fingerprints. There are the word endings in the first version, the most obscure version of what comes to be known as the Protocols. It's published with a different title initially, and in a newspaper owned by Pavel Khrushchevan, who was probably one of the main organizers of the Kishna Pogrom, and one of the most fervent of all far-right figures in late imperial Russia. The word endings used are unique to this particular region, and once published in book versions, they're all transformed into standard Russian. The word for Gentile, which, as you would imagine in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, is pretty frequent, is Goyevsky as opposed to Goysky. It's a Ukrainian usage as opposed to a Russian usage, and so there's plenty of evidence along these lines. And moreover, while working on this book, I was able to substantiate a lot of this linguistic evidence when I stumbled upon Khrushchevan's personal archive, which was in the home of a Moldovan Jewish journalist living in Brookline down the street from Fenway. It may sound exciting and sexy, the life of an historian, but it's mostly you're sitting in a room. I mean, you're sitting in a room and you're reading and you're writing and you're rewriting. God knows how much you're rewriting. So our adventure stories are archival stories. That's what we get out. You know, put on clothes, you get it. And so I heard. One of the joys of writing this book in particular, because this book draws on so many different archives, is just meeting so many different specialists. And part of the book draws actually on the notes that are housed in Trinity College, Dublin, of an Irish revolutionary, Michael David, who's hired by the Hearst Press to write about the Kishna Pogrom, who goes to Kishinev, writes the first best-selling book on Russian Jewry in any Western language. And so I got to know a good many Irish historians. They're fun. But I'd heard from, there's a small group of experts on the first version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, as I said before, the most obscure version. And I'd heard from one of them that there was a Moldovan Jew in Brookline who had something. And I didn't know quite what, but I was actually heading for Chisinau, current name of Kishna, the next day, and I was in Boston, and I figured I would see him. And sitting in his apartment after an hour or two, it turns out he had been a journalist, a fairly well-known journalist in Chisinau. He had written a history of a psychiatric hospital at the edge of town, and as he was describing this, he said, and this is what I acquired after writing about the psychiatric hospital, and he took a large white folder from his shelf and put it on my lap. And I realized after a little while of leafing through it that these were the most personal of all papers of Pavel Khrushchev, the most notorious, certainly one of the two most notorious anti-Semites in late imperial Russia. I started going through a journal of his, a diary. Now, Pavel Khrushchev actually has had a resurgence, as some of you may not have heard. He's had a resurgence in that highly contested part of the world, and is widely celebrated today as one of the great pioneers of anti-liberalism, of homophobia, of anti-Semitism. And the first full-length work written about him in 100 years was written by an email correspondent of mine, who is the second in command of the Foreign Service Office of a breakaway state. Moldova is such a non-state that it can't even control its borders, and at the eastern reaches there's a Soviet-style gangster state. And my email correspondent, this is being taped, right? uh, is the assistant foreign minister and wrote recently a full-length work in Russian on Khrushchev, praising him as a kind of father figure of the politics that he espouses. What I opened initially was a diary that Khrushchev had written at the age of 15 or 16, where he declares on page 3 or 4, as I recall, that he describes in some detail the sex he's having with a Cossack of the male gender, and how he wishes he was born a lady. What I also learned from this archive is that, and it seems incontestable, is we knew that his mother died very young. He was around 1. He mourns her loss all of his life. His father remarried, and there was basically no information about his stepmother. And what the archive revealed is that Pavel Khrushchev's stepmother was Jewish, and not only that, I'll go on one more time, but for one more astonishing bit of information, but it's the sort of information that had I been writing a novel and brought it to Norton and given it to the fiction editor, he or she would have said, no, such things don't happen. You're simply exaggerating. It turns out that at a dance in Kishinev, his stepsister, meets a Jew named Bronstein, no relation, and runs off with him to New York, where unmarried, and this is one of the most astonishing pieces of data, unmarried, he becomes a shamus at a shul. Apparently the qualifications were less onerous at the turn of the century in New York, and they eventually do marry, and she gives an interview to a Russian language American newspaper in the 1930s when, for a variety of reasons, Khrushchev's name is in the news, and her head is covered, she's frum, and she's been living the frum life in Baltimore all these years. I was able to substantiate that while, according to Jews and others, Khrushchev was the best placed anti-Semite in the Russian Empire, receiving all kinds of financial gifts from Tsar Nicholas II. In fact, he was experiencing serial bankruptcy. You can tell from the archive that I found, the papers are now at the Hoover Institution, that bailiffs assessed the value of his desk. I know the wood that his desk was made out of, the wood that his bookshelves were made out of, the assessment of his library, and there are all kinds of indications in it that indeed he was one of the first collaborators of the protocols. So these two forgeries, and protocols too, no doubt, are written with a kind of vile, horrible sincerity, with the belief that that living in Kishinev, they were actually witnessing Khrushchev and his group, and we pretty much know the names of the people close to him who collaborated on this document, a domestic document, a homemade document that has ended up having a greater impact than any anti-Semitic text in modern history. That they were reading the tea leaves, saw the impact of this pogrom, felt that it was empirical evidence of the enormous power that Jews exerted throughout the world, and consequently wrote this document, which, as many of you no doubt know, is written, and I think this is part of the key to its staying power, as a transcript. It's the elder of the Jews who's speaking. It has the power, if you will, of talk radio. And it's not a third-party text. It's not even the kind of text that is Mein Kampf. You actually have the elder of the Jews telling you what are his designs, and actually destroying the entire fabric of the world in order to bring on a Davidic kingdom. What I came to learn while working on this book was that while the Kishna Pogrom was in and of itself, as I mentioned before in passing, by far the best documented event in Russian Jewish history. We have documentation of all sorts. We have descriptions of almost all the homes that were ransacked, the names of the people who were ransacked, descriptions from Russian sources, descriptions from Chaim Nachman Bialik, the great poet who spent 5 weeks there, going house by house, interviewing people. We have all of his documents in their original Yiddish and in translation into Hebrew. While we have such massive documentation, almost everything that ended up being remembered was actually mythology. Why? What I would posit is this. Mythology, history, once you begin talking about historical episode, you almost invariably begin to stutter because of so much equivocation. Yes, this was a heinous pogrom. As many as 900, perhaps 800 people participated in it in a city of 100,000, with Jews making up about 40% of the population. But we have numerous incidents recorded by Bialik and others of Jews running into the courtyards or the homes of non-Jews and expecting to be saved, and they were saved. And so if you were to ask me quite simply to answer in the form of a tweet, weren't Jews incredibly hated in this city? I couldn't answer that question simply. Mythology, history sounds like Jeb Bush. Mythology sounds like the other one. And mythology doesn't have those cracked sidewalks, doesn't have those equivocations. A British ambassador can be foisted on us, even though we do not elect British ambassadors. They're selected. He was foisted like every other ambassador, but you could say it. You could say it, and my God, it just sounds so powerful and so clear. And once you actually begin talking in terms of history, you end up with a 427-page document that even members of Congress have not read. And I think that was one of the lessons that I took away from working on this book. Another lesson with regard to the etiology of modern anti-Semitism is that I can't really generalize that Kishinev was a place where Jews were roundly and particularly hated before the pogrom. There were a welter of attitudes for Jews: admiration for Jewish business capacity, fear of Jewish business capacity, admiration for Jewish mental acuity, and distrust of ostensible Jewish mental acuity. A host of attitudes. What anti-Semitism needs, what any racial hatred needs, is a coherent voice from somewhere on top to lend coherence to incoherent notions. And that is what Kishna did. Kishna owned the only local newspaper, Bessarabitz, and focused in especially on charges of ritual murder. A charge that is immensely difficult to prove because it's very hard to disprove something that doesn't exist. And there is an extensive charge of ritual murder in a nearby town. His newspaper gives it enormous credence. The body of the 15-year-old, and usually, the trouble with ritual murder is that when you try to disprove it, you're basically acknowledging that if it was proven, it would exist. And so the way in which ritual murder ends up being disproven is you see whether the blood of the murdered child is drained. Because ostensibly, in a ritual murder, you have to drain the blood. Well, if the blood is drained, does that mean there was a ritual murder? But ritual murder doesn't exist. And so it's an impossible thing to navigate around in the courtroom, before the courtroom, and in many ways, Khrushchev and his entourage give the charge legs, and that helps inspire a sufficient number of people who are sufficiently angry at Jews, or sufficiently drunk in the wake of Easter, or sufficiently tired in the wake of a long church service that where churches disgorge you in the early morning, or simply running with the crowd to engage in this activity. As an historian, it's even impossible to generalize simply about a truly murderous event and one of the events that define Jewish murder over the course of the 20th century, and an event that ends up having influence on people who know nothing about Kishinev, who've never heard about the city, but assume, for example, that the government the central Russian government is responsible for pogroms. The notion that the central government is responsible for pogroms was consolidated in the wake of the Kishna Pogrom. Let me just read you a page or two from the book, and then we'll talk. Little if anything, regarding Kishnev's riot would either be clear-cut or simple. Meticulously documented then and later, it would inspire a veritable thicket of myths, extending well beyond the confines of Jewish communal and political life, its impact surprisingly felt on endeavors as varied as the pre-state Haganah, the nascent Israeli army, the NAACP. I didn't get to it, so ask me questions about this, because the background to the NAACP owes a great deal to the Kishna Pogrom and the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Simple the story would not be, even in terms of its most obvious details, when the moment it occurred. Hence the pertinence of the account of Sergei Urusov, appointed Governor General of the Bessarabia province. Kishinev was its capital, to replace his disgraced successor soon after the pogrom. He relates in his memoirs how at the time of his appointment, he knew as little about the region as he might have about faraway New Zealand, and felt fortunate that a guidebook to the area had just been published. He pored over the book during his journey from Petersburg, carried it with him on his first few days in the provincial capital. He had the volume in hand as he made his way into one of the worst of the city's neighborhoods, known as Lower Kishinev or Old Town, the epicenter of the April anti-Jewish massacre. There, he writes, he sought the river that was reportedly nearby. Quote, nearing the end of town, I vainly tried to see the river mentioned. For a long time, I could not bring myself to identify it with a little ill-smelling pool in places not wider than a yard, without current, with no green on its banks. Thus, the first statement I gained from the experience of others, that Kishinev is located on the river Big, proved to be inaccurate. There is no river, not even a brook in Kishinev. The river Big does indeed exist. I have a picture of it on this page. A modest extension of the Dniester River. In the hot months of summer, when Urusov first saw it, it would in fact have been reduced to little more than a swamp. Still, the passage haunts, because the object of Urusov's frustration is a guide to Bessarabia, published in Moscow in 1903, written by one Pavel Khrushchev, who was soon also to publish and likely write or co-write the first version of the most infamous forgery in modern history, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The image of Urusov, a well-intentioned Russian official, quite sympathetic to Jews, hunting on a sweltering summer day for a river described in a book written by one of the world's most notorious fantasists, provides a bracing entry point for our tour of Kishinev too. Thank you.
Questions for Steve?
Okay, NAACP. I'm sorry about that. The Kishna Pogrom, news of it is carried throughout the American press, and especially the Hearst press. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Hearst has inherited his wealth. He doesn't only want to be an incredibly successful businessman, but he's hoping to actually run for the Democratic Party for the presidency. He's already in Congress, and has little allegiance to factuality. You can, okay. I'll give you a moment. And now turn to Rachel Maddow. And in any event, there's enormous attention not only given in the Hearst press but in the press throughout the Western world, and especially in the United States, where nearly 250 protest meetings were organized throughout the United States. Protest meetings are organized with regard to Kishna all the way to Australia. There are ersatz plays written by especially Bundes in one night and then performed. I've found manuscripts of plays written for the Broadway stage, none produced, but nonetheless written for the stage. And Kishna has an enormous impact in the spring of 1903. And what one finds is in an array of independent African-American newspapers, not those supported by Booker T. Washington, who, without disparaging anyone, was essentially the Nancy Pelosi of his time, but independent newspapers, mostly written by just one man or one woman, the newspapers that I ended up collecting. There's enormous impact, enormous extensive discussion of the Kishna Pogrom, acknowledgement that the Kishna Pogrom it was an event that ought to be condemned, but why is there so little condemnation of lynching? Indeed, even Booker T. Washington refuses to condemn lynching. Lynching at the time, as often as not, blamed on the victims themselves, blamed on black male sexual rapacity, blamed on blacks who were cooperating ostensibly with party machines, and blamed on black competition. The American Socialist Party is not engaged in condemning lynching because of black competition with white workers, and lynching basically gets no airing whatsoever, even in left-wing circles. But there is this discussion all through 1903 in these newspapers that doesn't end up getting any institutional buttressing. It does finally, in the wake of the 1905 revolution, after a couple, William English Walling, then well-known writer, he writes a book called Russia's Message, which is the most popular book about Russian radicals before John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World. John Reed acknowledges its impact in the introduction to his book. He travels in Russia and then marries a woman named Anna Strunsky with native Yiddish and Russian. I'm proud to say a graduate of Stanford University. And they come back to the United States and are visiting Chicago just as the Springfield anti-black riot breaks out, the first major anti-black riot of its time in a northern city. They actually travel to Springfield. Walling writes about it. Strunsky has been intermittently writing a book she calls her Pogrom book. And then in Cooper Union, in a launch of Walling's book on the 1905-1906 revolution and Russian radicals, quite spontaneously, it's Anna Strunsky who makes the intersectional statement, and it is nothing but an intersectional statement saying that as bad as pogroms are, and I've witnessed the aftermath of pogroms, lynchings are worse. And Anna Strunsky sets in motion the creation of what comes to be the NAACP. But as is so often true in the history of women, she ends up being written out of history. Her husband ends up being the first co-chair of the NAACP. The first organizing meeting of what becomes the NAACP, it's called by a different name in 1908, it's changed in 1909 to the NAACP, is held in their apartment on West 38th Street, but she's had a number of miscarriages, and she's ill, and she can't attend the meeting. In histories of the NAACP, she's barely mentioned at all, and the idea is hers. And he ends up being the first co-chair. He has to step down from the chairpersonship because he is a serial womanizer, and it embarrasses the NAACP. She spends a good deal of her life writing this manuscript called Revolutionary Lives. Never publishes it. The fullest copy in manuscript is at Special Collections at Yale. And as I was leafing through it, she ends up having two children. Written in pencil at the bottom of several pages is the words of one of her daughters saying, without doubt, our mother is the best mother in the world. And you're left just, asking yourself, what is it that really counts in history? Would her life have been more important had she finished Revolutionary Lives? Or given what she did. She just one postscript. She was very close to Emma Goldman, who in life was a lot less of an attractive human being, it seems, than on the page. And when Emma Goldman finishes Living My Life, her great autobiography, she sends it to her old friend Anna Strunsky and says, "This is my child. Isn't my child more impressive than yours?" And yeah, it was a sort of document that you read and you gasp. So that's a quick summary of the connection between Kishna.
Regarding the Pletha letter, how do you...
Where were you? Oh, okay. I just wanted to see you. Yeah.
To me?
How do you...
No.
How do you identify something like that as a forgery?
The Pletha letter?
Yes.
Well, we know authoritatively that it wasn't written by him. His documents, his office was extensively studied with the documents intact at the Ministry of Interior after the February Revolution, the first of the revolutions in 1917, with a complete inventory. And his primary assistant, Lapuchin, was actually one of the very rare Philo-Semitic High Russian officials. And so between the inventory, the very complete inventory that we have of Pleve's office, which revealed all sorts of embarrassing things, it was not an office that was cleansed, and the testimony of Lapuchin and other evidence that I could provide, it seems almost certain that it was not, it was a forgery. Who wrote it, we may never know.
So it seems, it seems like a constant theme of what you're saying, and especially of your historical.
Again, I just raise your hand, so sorry. Oh, yes.
Hi. Your historical purview is myth making, historical myth making, and I guess forgive me for being a Ukrainian Canadian in the room, but it seems like a lot of events. Sure. I was talking about myth making, and I was about to say that it seems like a lot of Eastern European events, important historical events, happen in Eastern Europe and then are translated maybe in Western Europe or maybe on this continent into a myth that has nothing to do with what actually happened and has very little to do with what the actual effects were in its local region. And we can think of a lot of events throughout the... Yes.
The history of mythology is history. But go on, I don't want to interject, but
Right, and I agree. But I was trying to ask, have you ever found any kind of commonality? Why is it that events in Eastern Europe are so mythologized and completely especially over the 20th century? I can think of so many things in current, a current U.S. or Canadian understanding of Eastern European history that have nothing to do with what actually happened in these places or when. And why is it that this keeps happening?
Yeah, it's a very good question, a very complicated question. Just one immediate response. We've known for as long as historians have been working on this issue that there is not a direct relationship between mass immigration from the East European region and pogroms, at least until after the pogroms of 1905, 1906. Proportionally, there's as much immigration from Austria-Hungary, from Galicia, the eastern reaches of Austria-Hungary, as there is for Russia. There's as much internal migration, numerically, from the regions of the northern part of the so-called Pale of Settlements that experienced barely no pogroms for 1905, 06, and movement to the southern regions where pogroms occurred. And we've been writing about this now for decades, and it's made absolutely no impact on collective Jewish memory. None of you will believe this when you leave this room. And I've been collecting for years the obituaries in the New York Times of Jews who were born in the Russian Empire, and 9 times out of 10, they've left Russia fleeing pogroms, and 7 times out of 10. They were born and left places where there weren't pogroms, and at least not at the time that they left. And but that doesn't answer your question. That just brushes up against your question. So much of the meaning of modern Jewish history is gleaned from this region. I mean, this is the region that persuaded Zionism that, that Jews could not be a healthy minority, but had to be a majority in another place. This was a region that gave birth to Jewish Socialist Labor Bund, that gave birth to leaders who they then excised from their own histories once so many of these leaders became communists in the early 1920s. And so the secondary sources, so-called, that we use to write history are really primary sources. They're fighting sources. And because so much of this history has given meaning, or was designed to give meaning to the way in which Jews ought to live in the future, these were the architects of the most coherent ideologies, secular ideologies, as to how Jews should live in the future. And so naturally, along with their prescriptions, they provided us with history. And so whenever one writes about this past, one is bumping up against not monsters, but mountains, impressive secondary sources, and that often monuments of intelligence, and at the same time inflected by passions and desires and beliefs that are not ours today. And so that's how I would begin to answer that question. Is that like at least poke at your question?
A little bit, I think so.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
I'm over here. In Bialik's poem, he's very critical of the Jews in the area and why they didn't come to the support of the other Jews. And he was criticized for that afterwards. Could you talk about that?
Who are we talking about? I didn't catch
Bialik's poem, City of
Yeah.
Slaughter.
Yeah.
He's critical of the Jews for not coming to the aid of their fellow Jews. And he was criticized for that afterwards.
Yeah. Yes. An entire chapter devoted to Bialik. What is your name, sir? Jerry. Jerry's question focuses on what is generally considered to be the most powerful, perhaps the finest, I don't know how one makes that judgment, finest poem in any Jewish language since the Middle Ages. A poem written by Chaim Nachman Bialik, who spends 5 weeks going door to door, writing very detailed notes about the April anti-Jewish riot, and is supposed to then provide the notes to the most influential Jewish historian of the day, Rosh Simon Dubnov. Instead, the notes are locked away. The notes are locked away until about 25 years ago for reasons that are completely mysterious. Bialik never explains it. It instead sits in the home of his father-in-law in a country house outside of Zhytomyr, and writes this poem. And the poem, you're absolutely right, is a ferocious attack, above all, not on the pogromists themselves, but on the cowardness of Jewish males. With extraordinarily searing stanzas, the poem had an enormous impact on galvanizing Jewish self-defense in 1905-06. The poem eventually had an enormous impact on the pedagogical curriculum of Jewish Palestine, eventually the state of Israel, and had a huge impact on educating generations of Israeli youth, children and youth, as to the nature of Jewish life in the diaspora. Now, part of what's curious, now I'll get to the most curious part in a moment. Part of what's curious about the Bialik's poem is that Bialik records in his notes many incidents of Jewish self-defense. And indeed there were many. A. B, as Bialik knew well, and as the Russian reading public knew well, one of the primary arguments made by defense attorneys for pogromists in trials that started in the summer, continued through December 1903, was that the pogromists in fact weren't pogromists. They were Gentiles engaging in self-defense. Jews are ferociously violent, And Jews transformed just a playful activity on the first day by attacking Gentiles, and the Gentiles simply engaged in self-defense, and why shouldn't they? And there was an incident where Jews armed with guns also attacked non-Jews, and this was then used as evidence of provocation. None of this is mentioned in Bialik's poem. And you're right, it was roundly criticized, but mostly it was widely celebrated. What I did discover, among the things I discovered when I tracked down Michael Davitt's notes, the notes he took while in Kishinev, just another brief archival aside, when I first contacted these Irish historians who I came to know, told me that he was a copious note taker, and I was able to track down the notes to Trinity College, Dublin, and it's much nicer to do research in Ireland than in Minsk. I was told, yes, the archive has the notes, but I couldn't see them because the paper that they were written on was so delicate. And so just as an archival tip, and I've used this in Russia as well, if you travel to an archive, especially from someplace that's as far away and exotic as California, and you sit there for a couple of days, and there's always material to see, and the archivist looks at you, and they see you know how to handle paper. After maybe a day and a half, they take pity, and that's what happens. And I was able to look at Michael Davitt's notes. Michael Davitt says this exact same thing that Bialik says about the shameless behavior of Jewish men. And he does not come with a Zionist arsenal. He talks about at least 100 men coming to his hotel room and admitting to him, hoping that he'll consequently help them emigrate. He didn't have the influence to do so, that they watched as their mothers, their wives, their daughters were raped. What I concluded in the book is that obviously acts of self-defense happened. The pogrom was a sudden event. There was no Jewish socialist labor Bund to speak of in Kishinev because there were very few factories. There were very few socialists. Jews were far better organized. A couple of months later at Gomel in September 1903, when more pogromists were killed than Jews. What I concluded was that what Bialik included in his poem is just the sort of unsettling data about a beleaguered people that you typically don't talk about. And journalism didn't talk about it, historians elided it, and he put it in the poem trying to be, it's a poem of, though a poem enormously exact. I actually was able to get a copy when I went to Kishna for the first time of the map that Bialik used. And he talks in the poem precisely about where the city slopes, it's built as small hills. You could follow him almost the topography of the city by reading the poem. It's that journalistic in quality. And I think he intentionally included data in his poem that others were too embarrassed to include. And so, yes, there was self-defense. Yes, Jews defended themselves. And yes, what Bialik describes occurred. And that's how I respond.
Hi, wanted to ask about the role of photography in the memory of the Kishinev pogrom. So you mentioned a bunch of different factors, but I'm always, sort of as a visual historian, I'm always interested in which relationship between visual documentation and suffering and tragedy, which is always, of course, as aesthetic as it is a political question. Especially, thinking now today, there are, in this digital age, there are like hundreds of horrific images that come out of war zones or from crises like at the border, but there are still particular images that stick with people, again, for political as much as aesthetic reasons. And so I was wondering, because you mentioned other pogroms afterward were also documented. So I was wondering, was there anything unique about the visual documentation of the Kishna pogrom? Were they more gruesome or evoke more pathos? Was there anything special?
It was the completeness of it, I think. In other words, you see all the victims from the edge of the photograph to the other edge of the photograph. I'm not a student of visual knowledge, and I respect such knowledge immensely. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know what to do with musical knowledge. I work with words. But seemed clear to me that this image, and Jews bury their dead very quickly, and photographs at the time take time. And this particular image, there were many images of torn Torah scrolls, of all sorts of images that were printed and reprinted in the press in the Western world, by and large. It was this image that was most widely printed. You couldn't tell the gender of the dead. It was women beside men, and you couldn't see their faces. They were all shrouded. You knew just based on Jewish ritual requirements that they would have to be buried very soon. And so if this picture hadn't been taken at that moment, it would never be taken. I think it was that image, and for that reason, that image actually captured the imagination. And because it extended from edge to edge, there was a feeling of almost infinity, that this was an event that, as Zionists saw it, described Jewish exile. As Bundists saw it, described Jewish fundamental vulnerability and the impossibility of living in a Tsarist Russia, and on, depending on whatever your ideological orientation might have been. You know, so I think this one more than anyone else, I think for the reasons that I'm suggesting.
Thank you. Yes, this is very fascinating. I'm learning a lot, and I have a question. When you mentioned history and metaphor and myth, and I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind saying more about how you're using the word myth, because what I'm gleaning from some of this is, first of all, isn't myth metaphoric? Also, is this part of a collective belief, not necessarily unconscious, but conscious belief in a myth, or is it an actual fact of a people that were exiled, suffering, and tragic? Is that mythic? Is that factual? Is that metaphoric? And is there some way that you wouldn't mind helping me to understand what you mean?
Just to clarify, and I may ask you to do some clarification too. I'm not by any means suggesting that the suffering I'm describing is myth. And that should be clear, right? That was clear? And I devote an entire chapter of this book, and in large measure because of the wealth of documentation that we have, to almost a 15-minute by 15-minute description of what the destruction actually looked like, to some extent felt like. We have all sorts of interviews that Bialik and others made, testimonies in courts. And so we have a wealth of material from various vantage points. So what struck me as extraordinary from the outset was the disproportionate meaning assigned to this particular event, in contrast to the relative obscurity of immeasurably more devastating events. There's a book review published in Bücherwelt in 1903 of what was the first volume. The second volume was never published, of Cherokhov's history of the Ukrainian pogroms. The second volume is in this building in manuscript. And at the very beginning of the review, as I recall, the reviewer says it's really crucial to take this book in because already in 1923, these events are being forgotten. Kishinev is never forgotten, even by those who have never heard of Kishinev. And so that struck me as important as a way of understanding what it is that chisels itself onto history and everything else that disappears. And what also struck me, and this gets a little bit closer, I think, to your question, and you're probably right that I'm using metaphor and myth more or less synonymously and perhaps sloppily. And if so, I apologize. And we can talk about that afterwards if that's the core of your question, and which I can see as you're nodding your head it is. And what struck me once I started digging further was how so much of the residue that ended up remaining, so much of the rubble that ended up remaining from this pogrom ended up being rubble that was actually historically inaccurate, while so much of what actually occurred ended up disappearing. And hence my use of myth. And I'll just go one step further, it became all the more puzzling to me once I came to realize that the overwhelmingly, the violence that ended up being recorded regarding the Kishna Pogrom was violence that occurred within the span of 3 or 4 hours on these small alleyways, and provided us with far more knowledge, historical knowledge, whether accurate or not, than any other events of the time, including even the very word pale. The word pale is not a translation for the Russian. The translation for the Russian is line. But the word pale was widely used at the time to describe the fortified Dublin in the Middle Ages. And pale is used in the subtitle of Michael Davitt's book, the first best-selling book in a Western language about the Jews of Russia. The word of pale is used intermittently as a translation, as a description of the area that Jews live in, the 15 provinces in Western Russia, plus Poland before 1903, but it becomes canonized afterwards. So that so much of the knowledge that comes to be the knowledge arsenal of ours of Russian Jewry ends up spilling from this pogrom. Hence, I think the word myth isn't inaccurate.
Okay. So we've sort of spent some time in this room. So because now that we've spent some time unraveling this myth and finding that beneath it is many complicated layers of reality and affect, that and that this has given us sort of this look at how these narratives are constructed and these sort of political fictions that we build ourselves on are constructed. But then, so my question is, what is the responsibility of people who see how these narratives are made, and historians who get to look at all of these realities without, I guess, the baggage and the affect, or when you see how complicated the truth really is, what then is your responsibility? Because I think most people in the world can't live like that.
My responsibility as an historian that I've tried to live up to is to try to write a book that is going to be read beyond the profession, and that I did. This is the first book that I did that. But I worked. As I saw it, my responsibility is to try to write about the things that I care about and know about the most with the greatest clarity as possible. And that's certainly not everything, but that's what I do. And informed by my own political inflections, cultural inflections that I own up to and acknowledge, albeit fleetingly, in the book itself. So it felt very important in this particular instance especially to write a book that would go beyond the field, but that would contribute to the field. Because contributing to historical knowledge, in my mind, is very important. And that's what ends up sustaining knowledge. But inasmuch as what I was writing about was the formation of contemporary Jewish consciousness in some ways, and consciousness about Jews, it seemed crucial to be able to write about it in such a way that it could be read. And so I interrogated literally every sentence and asked myself, do I really need to say this? Someone I met, actually, I was going to say in these halls, but metaphorically these halls, back at 86th and 5th, was Lucy Davidowitz, the well-known Holocaust historian. astonishingly acerbic human being, but at one point she said to me, she said, you know, you don't need to tell everyone everything you know. And it was a very important adage, and I just kept on shaving away and asking myself whether I've said enough in a sentence for historians to know that I've said enough, but that I've been able to reach others too. You do what you can do, and you recognize, hopefully as early as possible in life, what it is that you do well, and then you build on that. You don't simply rely on that because that can stultify you. You don't escape it necessarily because that can paralyze you. And you know, I learned, or decided, at least for myself, long ago when I wrestled with whether to work in journalism or in scholarship, that what you do in life is endowed with meaning. And so what you do in scholarship isn't everything. But as I see it, it's really something. And that's as clear an answer as I can give. Thank you very much.